And I'm really pleased to welcome Hugo Chapman as our first speaker this afternoon. And Hugo, as you know, is Chief Curator Department for History Drawings at the British Museum. And someone joined the department in 1995 after a decade the old Master Drawings Department in London Auction House. So we thought, again, another perfect person to introduce today's sessions because of his own career and trajectory. Previous to his time in trade, as it were, he studied art history at London University. He was saying he studied at Westfield. He was taught by David Lyman and Carolina. So again, already that's a very interesting combination of influences and teaching. Hugo is a curator of a Michelangelo drawing exhibition shown in the British Museum in 2006, and the co-curator, along with Marzia Faletti, of the 2010 exhibition shown in the round reading room devoted to 15th century Italian drawings, selected from the holdings of the BM Uffizi. And that exhibition travelled in the spring of 2011, so remained very active as an exhibition organiser alongside all of his other commitments. So today, Hugo's going to be talking, again, quite personally, I think, about his own trajectory and about dodging the label connoisseur from Christie's to the British Museum. And just before we introduce and welcome Hugo, just to say I think we'll follow the same format that Emanuele instituted this morning, the two talks, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards. So can we all welcome Hugo?
Thank you very much, Mark, for that. Of course, I'm here as the very odd creature of somebody who's been, usually the right path is to go from a badly paid academic job into the trade. I went from a very badly paid job at an auction house to an even worse paid job at a museum, but never regretted it. And like Martin, I want to say that this is very much my own view. I don't speak for the British Museum. And I am wearing a tie, so I suppose I could be pigeonholed in a particular way. But I suppose what I'm going to talk about is really connoisseurship, or talking about the cataloguing of things, really not away from British art. And I think these polarities may be more true of British art. I certainly don't think my Italian colleagues would necessarily recognise that the knowledge of expertise in a particular artist means that they went to a particular school or a particular university. That is not the case. So there I am. Those are my two worlds: the world of Christie's, and then to the world of the British Museum. With the lower right, we're having our ceiling painted, which is why it's a very, very noisy and scaffold-filled place at the moment. Now, why do I, although I admire the qualities of connoisseurship, it's not a word that I would be frightened of. I would never, ever, I would rather sort of gouge my eyes out with a kind of rusty penknife than describe myself as a connoisseur. Because I think it's, in fact, when I arrived at Christie's in the mid-'80s, I think my rather wise boss told me at a certain point, don't describe yourself as an expert, because that suggests you have some expertise. Describe yourself as a specialist. And ever since then, I've described myself as a specialist in Italian drawings. It kind of, because for me, the word connoisseur is either that, it's largely formed by looking at Daumier drawings and prints. It's either the old man seated in the chair, kind of admiring his own art collection, or it's the kind of complete buffoon, pompous, talking about matters of dating and naming. But at the same time, I do think the naming of things and the classification of things is important, and I think we all agree that. And I think for drawings it has a particular relevance in that a drawing on the whole tends to be the work of a single artist. I think it's much, much more complicated when you're looking at a Rubens altarpiece or a large-scale painting, because it's not the work of a single individual. It's a sort of collective work, but that's not normally the case with drawings. So I'm just going to talk about how I got to where I am. And as Mark said, I was at Westfield College, and at a certain point when we had to decide what we wanted to do in terms of speciality, I decided with a handful of people to go and work on the Renaissance side, which Caroline Elam taught. And I've taken as my sort of the text of English connoisseurship, Richardson's 1719 discourse, and I think there's so much of the problems of the word connoisseurship come out of that use of the word science, which of course in the 18th century had a very different connotations to what it means today. But there I was as a kind of spotty 19-year-old, and we were looking at Raphael, and I found Raphael completely antithetical. I mean, he was so sort of perfect and wonderful in his paintings, and I really didn't sort of get him at all. And then we began to look at his drawings, and so here are the three Raphael manners, the Perugino, the Florentine, and the Roman manner. And we spent a lot of time looking at his drawings, and to me that was the sort of the moment that I realised actually it was through the drawings that I felt, I gained an understanding, because one senses this extraordinary kind of creative intelligence that Raphael had that I didn't initially detect in his paintings. And I think the question of whether you can be taught connoisseurship, I think is, I don't think it's, it's really something that universities should set out to do. I think what they should set out to do is show students, expose students to works of art, and directly, whether it's in the Tate or in the students' room, in the study room of the British Museum. And I'm very, very grateful that both Pat Rubin and Caroline Elam did that, because it changed my life. And because looking at these things through digital images is not the same as looking at them at first hand. Now, this is Richardson's rather wonderful phrase where he kind of dodges the whole nature of the art trade, and we sort of come to the nub of, because in 1985, 1985, I joined Christie's. And, I mean, Martin has sort of painted a very sort of particular picture of how the art trade works, and I can only speak of my time at Christie's, which is a long time ago, 20 years. But I can say, well, I was paid, I was employed by Christie's, but I was under no pressure. And it sounds rather naive, but it's the truth. I was under no pressure at any point to say that I thought a particular drawing was by a particular artist. In fact, I seem to spend my time telling owners that their drawing wasn't by the artist that they thought it was, and in fact was by some extraordinary minor or an anonymous artist. But what one in those days, there were five sales a year, and one was confronted with a mountain of material which one had to put a name to or not put a name to. And here I just, to give you a sense of the difficulties of putting names to and the many failures, are some anonymous works in the British Museum, anonymous English drawing, anonymous French drawing, and this one, which I'm really hoping somebody here who knows neoclassical art much better than I do will know what the hell this is, because this lurks in the Italian 19th century box. But I always thought, somebody out there must know what it is. And so there was a certain integrity, I think, about what I did at Christie's. There was no, as I say, I was allowed to play with trying to put names to things, and I made some spectacular mistakes. And this is probably one of the worst cataloguing. This is the one that I wake up in the middle of the night. This is the sort of thing that Bendor kind of, rubs his hands with glee. This was a work that came very late on, didn't really have time to study it, sort of looked at it, thought, Gothic P, watermark, classic sign of a German drawing, didn't really know. We all sort of scratched our heads together, well, we called it North Italian School, 15th century. It actually turns out to be by Schungar, and is a study for his painting the Madonna of the Rose Garden, and becomes the earliest known sort of independent botanical drawing predating Dürer's piece of turf. So very much, if one wants a great example of the importance of a name and making then the wider context, as I agree absolutely that the name is only a very small part of it, this study is, stands at the beginning of a great tradition. And so, this is the one that really was appalling on my. I just had never ever seen anything like it, and I probably never will see anything like it again. But the training of being in the art, of being what I would describe as a kind of auction house hack, is that your discoveries, the things that you discover, are without name. I mean, this is a drawing on the right-hand side that I was sent in those days, pre the internet. Some really sort of grubby Xerox of this drawing came from Scandinavia with, do you know what this is? And I sort of carried it around in my pocket for a long time until I worked out that, in fact, was related to the drawing on the left, which is a Rembrandt in the British Museum. And it was subsequently sold for a sort of fair amount of money, of which I sadly didn't get a percentage of. It is now in the Getty, and the story of its attribution is completely disappeared and gone. It's my name is not mentioned anywhere, and why should it be? It's not particularly interesting. But there is an element where I think academics can be sometimes disingenuous about things that they discover. I mean, the best one that I ever read was in an Italian article which said, I won't mention the name of the artist, but said, I knew when I first opened the Christie's catalogue that the work was by X, and this was a sort of moment of great reverence. It didn't actually say that the name of the artist X was written below. So it wasn't much of a revelation, but anyway, that would have spoiled a good story, I suppose. But I do think if one looks at the history in my field, in drawings, there's been a huge amount that the knowledge of the trade over the years has enriched the subject, and also it goes in waves. And this is, not that I'm obsessed, of course, but this is another drawing by Schungar in the British Museum, one of the very rare drawing, and it's inscribed at the top by Dürer. And Ockley, William Young Ockley, one of my heroes, who, like me, was in the trade and then became keeper of prints and drawings in the 1830s, when he knew exactly what it was and called it Schungar. And then later on, it goes into Lawrence's collection, and it's then sold as part of the Woodburn Lawrence sale, and it is bundled in a lot, four on the lot, as anonymous and so it then has to be rediscovered all over again. And the sort of anonymity of the art world, here is a drawing, Michelangelo's Haman, one of the great masterpieces by Michelangelo in the VM. And it was in Lawrence's collection, and when Lawrence died, Samuel Woodburn put together 100 of the great Michelangelo drawings in the collection. And here he talks about, it is very remarkable, M. Angelo has drawn one of the legs over on which he has, by means of small round marks, indicated the exact place for the principal light, i.e. the highlights. And it's a beautiful observation, and it gives you an incredible sense of the drawing as a working tool. This is what, for all of the, our kind of aesthetic appreciation of the drawing, for Michelangelo, this was about preparing the figure in the Sistine Chapel. And indeed, if you look at other drawings by Michelangelo, here's one 40 years later, they're covered with these little tiny dots because he's using exactly the same system. And that, in fact, that observation was lost until Michael Hirst noticed that this that had been made in the Lawrence catalogue, and kind of reanimated the idea of why these things were this notation was being made by Michelangelo. And so, in 1995, I had 10 years of Christie's. I noticed that Christie's was full of divorced men and women, because you basically work 6 days a week. And I was incredibly obsessive about drawings. I mean, I spent 5 days cataloguing them at Christie's, and then the morning of Saturday I would go to the British Museum, and the afternoons I'd go to the V&A. I mean, it was a sort of incredibly sad drawings anorak. And the job went, Nicholas Turner, my predecessor, went off to the Getty, and they needed an Italian drawings curator. And the way the interview was sort of arranged was a big pile of Italian drawings with the names covered over. Obviously one had to sort of talk about other things, but that was sort of the core of the interview. And of course, that's what I did for my day job. I mean, it was sort of quite, I could do that. So, I got the job. And then I noticed how I'd gone. And so this is a map showing you the 1.1 miles between Christie's and the British Museum. And I noticed this extraordinary change that when I stepped into the British Museum, people suddenly were sort of, they would ask my opinion, and I would say, oh, well, Hugo, he's at the British Museum, he knows what he's talking about. They treated me like a sort of, as I say, an auction house hack 1.1 miles away. So I realized that I hadn't changed. There wasn't some sort of magical transformation in this journey. I was the same, right and wrong, capable of making appalling mistakes. And so the way that I navigated that was my decision that I would never, ever have my name in any catalogue, in any dealers. I mean, people could approach me. I was willing to give my opinion freely, but I wasn't going to be quoted. I wasn't going to be sort of said to be the authority, which sort of gives one a certain freedom, I suppose. But at the same time, there's, one does, at times it is frustrating, because people show me something, as, in the British Museum, I say, well, I think that's by artist X, and there's a sort of whooshing noise, and then the work appears on the front cover of Christie's and Sotheby's. But, I don't see any other way of navigating it without that anonymity that I had before as working at Christie's. And I think that, in the old days, the power of the market in order to make academics and museum people want to get involved was very much about the photograph. If you come and look at this thing, I will give you a photograph. And of course, that's sort of gone now. I mean, we all have images of whatever we want. And so, for me, I don't want my name involved in working out whether something is by Michelangelo or not. I'm very willing to give my opinion, but it has to be an anonymous one. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. And the reason I think why in '95 was a particularly good moment for me to get that job is they were facing a new world, the British Museum, when basically you had to catalogue the entire collection because they were beginning the computer cataloguing, and that meant a very different dynamic, because whereas you could put a drawing in a box for years and just call it Michelangelo, once you started to actually catalogue everything, you had to put a name to it, and so you had to make the choice as to whether the one on the left or the one on the right was by Michelangelo. I mean, does it matter? Ultimately, I mean, I think one is, I know which one I prefer to spend time with, but the copy is as fascinating. The copy, if the original was lost, would still give you the idea that Michelangelo had made this drawing. But, one had to name names, and there it is. I don't know whether you guessed rightly. So that's here it is on the collections online, and there is the other one. And I think we've touched on this a number of times. I think, okay, there's a light bulb moment in your head, perhaps, but unless you can actually explain the reasoning in a very sort of Richardson sense, what the process in your head was, how you can say that this is by Michelangelo, I don't think you can really kind of, you're not really doing the public service. You have to be able to explain why you think this one is the correct one and the other one is the copy. And of course that's open to debate. There's something at the bottom of this sheet which says, if you have any comments, please, send it in as an email, and we get quite a lot. So in a way, the authority is more porous, but in the end, somebody has to decide what this is called. And in the process of cataloguing the collection, there are sometimes small points. This is from a group of 22 Roman views by Canaletto, which had sort of lurked in a penumbra because Constable and Links had called them attributed to. They were rather bad drawings. They're not very well executed. What were they? People sort of circled round and round them. They couldn't possibly be by Canaletto. And when I was cataloguing them, I realised that actually they're dated August the 10th, 1720, which is exactly when we know that Canaletto was in Rome with his father at the beginning of his career. He's a scene painter, and this is what a scene painter's drawings might look like. And so from that then came out a whole, what these drawings were for, their use, how they were used by Bellotto later on. And as Martin said, the naming and the dating of it is just the beginning. It's a very small part of it. It's actually the whole kind of context and what it tells us, I think, is a much richer part of what a museum collection is. And here I'm showing my kind of 80s, the great film, The Repo Man, where Emilio Estevez works in a supermarket and everything is just labelled food, and he drinks stuff called beer without branding. And I think, a lot of people, say to me, well, categorization is not terribly important, classification, it's sort of, it is if somebody's, it's not very important if somebody's sort of done the hard work kind of thing. If we just listed everything as, drawing or print, it would be a hell of a lot harder work to extract any kind of, whatever your approach was, whether it was subject or gender or politics or theoretical, if a basic kind of classification is required. And I think, connoisseurship is also, it's not just about the name or the date or all those things. It's about describing a woodcut as a woodcut and a wood engraving as a wood engraving, and correctly so. And when one comes across places where those things are mislabeled, then that's appears in other places. So one really the simple job of describing things, which I think is one way of describing what a connoisseur does, is fundamental to the museum. But at the same time, the naming of things, the British Museum is full of things that don't have any names. And this is just to please Arlene, I've just taken some examples of the ephemera of Sarah Sophia Banks. Clearly it would be sort of bonkers if you spent your time trying to work out who the printmaker was here, because actually the fascination of these things is what they are, what they tell us about 18th century consumer culture. And, if anyone was worried about kind of what the naming of names, I love this one, the perfect copies of Stradivarius, and the lovely print shop that was in the Tottenham Court Road. So, it made me temper the idea, probably in the beginning, that naming things was very important. I'm not really so concerned with that, or less and less concerned with that, because just the nature of the collection of the British Museum. And another, how the value of works, which of course, taints the kind of the connoisseur. Once they're in a museum, they sort of don't have a value. I mean, this is our, on the left, the Honus Wagner cigarette card, which fetched a huge sum of money because Honus Wagner was virulently against smoking. And this is our very own Honus Wagner cigarette card, which lives happily with 1.5 million other cigarette cards. I think it's in a special plastic folder, but that's about that's about as far as it gets. And all of us are trying our very best not to get interested in cigarette cards, that we don't have to catalogue them. But it's not about value or classification according to importance. I mean, a collection like the British Museum, museums generally, their collections have an enormous depth to them, and to say that this thing is more important than another, I don't think is part of what a curator does. And the basic point of obviously the putting names to things. I mean, here's that great picture. I think anybody who's kind of thinks they're going to announce to the world that they've discovered a new Leonardo should look at this picture of Gerd Heidemann holding the Hitler diary, which actually he'd been party to falsifying. And on the right, the wonderful painting of Ossian. And of course, as a cultural phenomenon, I think the Hitler diaries and indeed Macpherson's Ossian are fascinating. But if my children, in their seemingly endless study of the Second World War, were using the Hitler's diary as a source material, or indeed we were studying as a view of looking into the sort of Celtic twilight of literature, Ossian, that would be a mistake. And similarly, I think fakes have their part. There is a marvellous Samuel Palmer on the right, soon to be in the Tate Kenneth Clark show, and then the Tom Keating, which David Beinman very kindly gave us, which because his brother was defending Tom Keating. So that was a freebie. But below it is a very fine Eric Hebborn that we bought. So the development of some kind of idea of what an original is and what a fake is quite important in order not to waste public money. And strangely, actually, the thing about Hebborn is we can't illustrate it on our database because we don't have the copyright. And so there's been a sort of... I came across a blog where it was sort of said that there was an enormous British Museum conspiracy to hide our Hebborns. And actually, if I describe this as follower of Van Dyck, there's no copyright issue. But as an Eric Hebborn, there is, because I don't know who holds his copyright. So there you go. And lastly, often I think there is a misguided idea that somehow the scientists will come to our rescue. And of course, science and conservatism can be, hugely important. And in both catalogues, both the Michelangelo and in the Italian Renaissance, we look very closely using non-invasive technical analysis of the way these things were made. And this is an example where a silver point drawing, or what we thought was a silver point drawing, under infrared, the left-hand figure more or less disappears, which is what happens with silver point, but the one on the right didn't. So that, and in fact, once you pointed that out, there is a difference in colour, so the one on right is by lead point. But it doesn't actually tell you whether the left one is by Filippino Lippi, the right one is by Filippino Lippi. It just tells you that they were drawn on two separate occasions. As it happens, I think both are by Filippino Lippi, as much as that matters. And here, because I'm very conscious, in Richardson's words, whether you're interested in the difference between an apple and an oyster. I think sort of talking about connoisseurship can be essentially dull, because there are people who don't, think it's particularly important, and I, respect that. And so, like the tired boy yawning on the right, I will now shut up. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Hugo. So we'll have the chance to ask Hugo questions after our next speaker. And our next speaker is Dr. Spike Bucklow, Senior Research Scientist at the Hamilton Carr Institute, Fitzwilliam Museum and University of Cambridge. And Spike is a BSc in Chemistry, a PhD in the History of Art, so a wonderful combination of qualifications, and worked in several capacities as a chemist before studying artificial intelligence at South Bank Polytechnic, London. And then he worked in technical management consultancy before training as a conservator of easel paintings, qualifying in 1993. He's a Wingate Scholar and a Quest Craft Scholar, both scholarships he won in the 90s. And Spike Bucklow's research interests fall into two broad categories: visual perception and artists' techniques. Research into visual perception includes work on formal connoisseurship of paintings to the classification of technical imagery. And his research into artist techniques includes theoretical and practical work on pigment recipes. And while specialising in pre-20th century art, he has a particular interest in medieval and early modern painting. So, again, we thought with that sort of background and knowing Spike as we do, he'd be a perfect contributor to today's discussion. So can you welcome Spike Bucklow? Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Mark very much for inviting me. Oh, that's me. Yes. Because I'm a conservation scientist, and conservation and science have both been mentioned this morning. I'm not here to defend bad conservators, nor am I here to defend scientists who like to put things in synchrotrons. I have to hold my hand up and say I have never done that. And although I'm meant to be talking about technical knowledge and conservation, it says here, I'm also going to stray into the area of teaching connoisseurship, which cropped up a bit this morning as well. And that is because I feel that the educational environment today somewhat conspires against the acquisition of connoisseurship. And one of the reasons for that is because and this is because classifications that are based on things like force of grace or borrowed comeliness are rather hard to define. And I think language has been mentioned a couple of times today. And I think that's a very important thing about the acceptance or not of connoisseurship, the fact that it does involve description, and it does involve descriptions which are not necessarily transparent. And in a culture that likes accountability, there is a serious problem for conservation. And the educational system does not necessarily deal with that particularly well. I want to just take two case studies, one very, very quickly, to look at the vanity of small details and how they help, and how technical help in terms of classifying things, and how technical details assist you. I apologise, the quality is not terribly good. But what I want to do is just mention an occasion when 9 Lely or studio of Lely paintings came simultaneously to the Hamilton Institute. They had been assigned to autograph or studio, and so when the conservators involved were cleaning, they looked for small details that may be consistent with the attributions. And the detail I want to point out here is the curl of paint over the forehead. And the way in which the conservator thinks about a painting generally, well, I don't know, bad conservators The way in which we train conservators at the Institute to try and think about a painting is in terms of the way it has been produced, and that involves cultural issues outside of the material issues. But in terms of the material issues, it's important to know that Lely's hand was involved in all, he was involved in the studio work, things that are called studio as well, and that there is a dead colouring, a monochrome black and white image of the face that was taken of the sitter from life. Sometimes a flesh paint was painted over that by the studio, and sometimes by Lely. On the right, what you see is the flesh paint that has been painted over the monochrome dead colour by a member of the studio who has completely obscured the dead colouring. And then when that flesh paint is dry, the hair, little squiggle of hair, is painted on as well. On the left, you see, I hope, and this is where the eye of faith comes in, that this is Lely's own flesh paint, and what he's done is leave reserves so that small areas of the dead colouring still show through. And immediately below the curls of paint, it should look a bit greyer, I hope, because that's actually a reserve in the dead colouring showing through. The same dead colouring shows through underneath the eyebrow, and on the right, or proper left, temple as it goes into shadow. So here we're looking at a different way in which, a different process, rather than only trying to look at a product. And it becomes easier to consider the product when it is seen in terms of the process. Now, conservators will sometimes take paint samples out of paintings when there are damages. And I completely take the point made this morning that there is a connoisseurship of this, and that if you don't have a large number of paint samples, you do not have the comparative body in which to make sense of it. But there are something like 15,000 paint samples at the Hamilton Carr Institute, and so I think we can look at this as a meaningful image. It is something which is about less than half the size of a pinhead, seen through a microscope, and I hope you can make out there's a grey layer at the bottom and then what looks like a white layer on top. The grey layer is the original dead colouring, and the white layer, what looks like white layer, is the flesh. Now, on the right-hand side, any kind of stratification of the image would look like that, but on the left, with Lely, you'd find that sometimes that white layer is totally absent, and all you're seeing is the grey layer. Now, the point of showing you this fragment is it's easier to understand this fragment. It's not rocket science that the first layer goes on at the bottom and then things climb up. You're looking at a temporal sequence here, which is a lot easier to understand than the finished product. In so doing, we are, of course, entering into the modern program of looking at fragments, which we all know, and there is a connoisseurship of the fragment. But the point is, the fragment is easier to look at than the whole object. And if one of the things that is posing a difficulty for connoisseurship is language, then looking at that is simpler. This is it's a spectrum, it's a scientific image, and what I want you to do is consider that this is actually dead simple as an image compared to either Lely or a studio of Lely. However, you, in interpreting this, are using exactly the same connoisseurial skills, in that we can say that we've got a rather boring background here of vertical and horizontals, and we've got 6 figures which are coloured and wiggly and therefore slightly more interesting in the foreground. We could say that if we read it from left to right, the figures are conforming and behaving the same way. They will go up and then they come down. But on the right-hand side, they seem to depart. And I would say that at around 700, some of them go up and along, and the others carry along. These are connoisseurial judgments. I would then say that my interpretation of this is that one of them is an expensive blue pigment and the other is not, because I would then compare it to other similar wiggly lines. Now, the point about the power of science and why it has inveigled its modern science as opposed to Richardson's idea of science the way it has inveigled itself into the attribution of paintings and the like, is because this is dumbed down connoisseurship. This is very simple, but the conceptual task involved is exactly the same as what the art historian is doing in a much more complex situation. Now, if you're going to simplify things, you need to know what the eye will see, because the idea of training the eye came up this morning, and I think as a bit of luck, that's what I'm interested in my talk. That the eye is aware of certain things, but not aware of all things. So I hope you can all see a 5 by 5 square of the letter R off-center in both of these images. On the left, it is the differentiating thing is the scale. On the right, the differentiating thing is the orientation. Now, scale and orientation are both visual stimuli that are called pre-attentively discriminable. You don't have to pay attention to them to be able to see them. And that way, especially on the left, it's easy to see the square. And I want to show you something which is not pre-attentively discriminable, and that's a collection, again, 5 by 5 square, and inside the square are the figure 10, and outside the square are the figure 5. They both are 3 long strokes and 2 short strokes, but one of them is 3 long strokes and 2 short strokes in a closed, with closure, which is the 0 of 10, and the other is a continuous open figure. Now, if you look, you can see the difference between an individual 5 and an individual 10, but you cannot see you cannot see the square. You have to give it focal attention. So if you're trying to train the eye or trying to understand what the connoisseur's eye is doing, you have to know what the eye looks for, both unconsciously, the kind of blink, and also the think, what you have to think about. Now, conservators look at paintings in different ways because they're primarily interested in the physical object. And this is a conservator's view of how to describe crack patterns. Now, Michael Baxendale had pointed out that European languages are very rich when it comes to Euclidean geometric visual structures, and they're very poor when it comes to textural phenomena. So if a Western European wants to define textures, they are fighting a losing battle because our language is not up to it. So everybody has ignored this completely, and quite rightly. And what I'd like to say is when you have problems that are basically about terminology and very complex things, we can always use a comparative method rather than an absolute method. And that, of course, is nothing new to you. The difference between what I'm going to suggest as a connoisseurial act, well, it's not a connoisseurial exercise. It is an eye training exercise, which is what precedes connoisseurship, is that here Wolflin has understood that there is a relationship between linear and painterly, and he said there's some chronological relationship between them. But we can do exactly the same thing without knowing the significance of the 2 poles of the dichotomous construct. And so what I would like to do is look at boring cracks on paintings. And I did this because 19th century connoisseurs had specifically identified this as an attributional clue. And I won't want to describe the thing on the left or the thing on the right, but they're very obviously different. One looks like mud, and it's therefore the way in which it has been generated is by a liquid behavior. And the one on the right looks very solid. It looks like porcelain. And the way it's been generated is a very different way of generating. So again, just as with the Lely example, you don't try and think about the object, you try and think about the way in which the object has been created. Here we have 2 different modes of creating problems on paintings that can be used. Now, I know that we're meant to be, it's slightly, never mind. This is meant to be about British art, and you don't see the word British there, but if you give me 5 minutes, I hope to show that this could contribute. I feel this does contribute to an understanding of British art, but basically I want to look at 4 categories of paintings. And I've chosen those categories of paintings because they are quite discrete technical ways of making paintings. And what I want to do is show you some crack patterns from them. None of these kind of cracks are going to be evident because these are a dead giveaway. And I would like, if you want to play the game, you to make notes, and then I will ask you a question about a crack pattern. So, I have 6 dichotomous constructs in a Wolflin-esque way. However, I don't know what significance they may or may not have. They are perceptually easy. We know what small things are, we know what big things are. We don't have to pay attention to them. If you think about the islands of paint between the cracks, they can be small or they can be large, of course, anywhere in between. Now, if you're interested in identifying an Italian panel, this is pretty useless because both of these are found on Italian panels, so it is not unique. Italian panels can be any of them. So this is the first of 6. The second is it may have a direction or it may not have a direction. The overall feeling, I would say, is there is a direction on the left and there is no direction on the right. Or you could say the islands are squarish on one side and not particularly on the other. The third out of 6 is if there is a direction, is there any orientation that you can relate to the painting as a whole? So both of these, I would say, are offering a vertical direction, but because the panel was a portrait, it is parallel to the on the left, parallel to the longest dimension, and the canvas painting on the right, it's perpendicular to the longest dimension because that's a landscape. The fourth thing is the individual curves, individual cracks can be curved or they can be straight. The French example is curved, the Dutch example is straight. Both of them are on canvas. Or they can be jagged or smooth. Both of these are on panel. The jagged one is Italian, the smooth one is Flemish. And the last one is they can all be the same uniform thickness, which the one on the right more or less is, or you can say there are 2 separate generations maybe of cracks, and that's an Italian panel. So having shown you all of the extreme versions, what I'm doing basically is trying to break something down and dumb it down, because that's what science is. Science is dumbed down connoisseurship. And here are those 6 dimensions. It doesn't matter what you call them. I put numbers at the bottom because I fed this into a computer, and whilst we don't trust connoisseurs, we do trust computers. So I have the numbers are for the computer. Okay, so having looked at the dimensions, I now want to look at the 4 categories very quickly. Italian panels are sometimes large, sometimes small, the islands. Sometimes got a direction, if so, usually perpendicular. That means because this is a panel, a portrait, it's more or less horizontal, jagged and secondary. Just show you 2 to say there's quite a lot of variation. Now, this we could post-rationalize as saying this is the way a panel falls apart when it's made out of a piece of poplar which is probably 2 or 3 inches thick, when it has a crystalline gesso priming, and it's got tempera paint on top. The panel expands and contracts with humidity. The wood wants to move. The paint doesn't want to move. The tension is transmitted from the wood through to the paint via a jagged kind of crystalline layer. And that's what you end up with. Flemish, small, usually with the direction, if so, parallel, smooth, usually uniform cracks. And that's what happens if you have a painting that is sitting on a very thin piece of oak and with a very thin layer of chalk. The oak is a much more controlled piece of wood when it's thin. The one above, you could practically count the tree rings and do dendrochronology on it because each crack is following a growth ring. The one on the bottom, I put confusing things in just to liven it up. Dutch canvas, medium-sized, often got a direction of, say, perpendicular, jagged, smooth, cracked, square islands. Now, that is because the tradition usually used a plain weave canvas. It was prepared with glue, which was quite brittle. The cracks, therefore, follow individual threads, and because the thread is a wavy thing, the crack turns out to be wavy, and square because it's plain weave canvas. Dutch, on the other hand, French, on the other hand, usually large, no direction, usually curved and smooth, because a French 18th century canvas is usually painted on herringbone canvas, which is much stronger, redistributes the tensions. It has a flexible oil ground, so it delocalizes again the tensions, and you see much more kind of fluid behavior in transmitted through to the paint. So, my question is, would you like to attribute to one of those four categories these two crack patterns? Anybody? Thank you. Would there be a general consensus about French on the left? Yeah, okay. The one on the right's more difficult. Any guesses to that? Dutch or Flemish, I heard? Flemish? Are we more of a consensus for Flemish? Okay. I'd agree with you that on the left it looks French and on the right it looks Flemish. But because there is a danger associated with connoisseurship that one might privilege the kind of information that you are privy to and others are not, I've actually chosen two things. One of them is Dutch and the other is Italian, to show that no single characteristic of something as complicated as painting can possibly be reliable. I've thrown in two red herrings. But the interesting thing is that the painting by the Dutch person is a topographic view of Paris. So without taking the painting off the wall, I know he bought his materials in Paris. And you all know Anthony de Messina is one of those who's accredited with bringing Flemish techniques into Italy. So, and the crack pattern told you that. So, I put numbers at the bottom because computers are allegedly allegedly accountable, whereas individuals are not. The word trust was mentioned at some point today about you have to trust a connoisseur. For some reason, we don't bother about trusting computers, but we do bother about trusting individuals. So the colours maybe don't show you terribly well, but this is a clustering that shows that you give that information to a computer, and I've done it in three different ways. Well, not me personally, but other PhD students have, and you always get the same answers in different methods. But if we reclassified the Dutchman, Knip, as group 5, you see that he's more French than the French. So the computer got it wrong as well. And if you reclassify Anthony de Messina and Giovanni Bellini, they turn out to be more Flemish than Flemish in the ones that I looked at. Now, you could say, what's that got to do with British art? I'd say it does. And I've been very privileged to work with my colleagues on a lot of English paintings, rood screens, for example, which have all sorts of strange attributions and influences. And we've looked at them technically as well. And on the right, you see a rood screen that is in Norfolk, and there's a cross-section from the blue paint passage. That cross-section, that layer structure build-up, is exactly what one would expect to find on a Flemish panel painting. And on the right, on the right. On the left, the Devon rood screen, this looks completely different in terms of the layer build-up, and it's much, much closer to what one would expect of French painting. So we have two paintings, more or less contemporary, different sides of the country, apparently different influences. What I'm suggesting is that we can consider this kind of information and use it, if we so choose, These are called British cracks in continental Europe because British 19th century painters were so bad they fell apart. But of course these are not exclusive to British painting. The point is that when these occur in continental European painting at the same time, it's called a British crack. So I would say of these four images that I showed you before, a Flemish, an Italian, a Dutch or a French, one could look at the ways in which British art has been influenced in technical terms. Because I think one of the things that has struck me about a definition of British art is that it is continuously eclectic and very open to influences from outside. And this can be used, if you want, to look at it. So, for example, here we have a British painting. And it's up to you to say whether you think that's more northern or southern in influence. I would say southern. Thank you very much.
So, Spike, do you want to come up to the table? Will you repeat the arrangement that we had earlier on? And Hugo too. Came to the Great. So we have some time now for questions and discussion. So first of all, maybe can I open it up to the floor and ask whether there are particular questions that have immediately been stimulated from the two talks that you have?
Silence them.
Well, I'll ask one because that's my job. I've got a particular question that was thrown up by your paper, Hugo. When you talked about the feeling that you had and the responsibility you had to actually describing the differences that you detected between the two, or explaining the reasons why and the characteristics of the image that led you to the decision to call one a Michelangelo and one a follower of or a copy of. So I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the kind of language that you find yourself ending up using in distinguishing between the two works, and about whether that actually, and the question I think, the broader question is whether that language will be seen by others as about what kind of character that language will have in the vocabulary you use. But it'd be interesting, first of all, to hear you use that vocabulary before deciding what kind of character it has.
Well, I suppose, first thing I should say that I can hide behind Johannes Wilder, who's probably the greatest kind of expert on Michelangelo drawings, who comes from Britain via Hungary and the Courtauld. So it was his decision-making. But I suppose the language you use is one about, and again, there are incredible inadequacies about it, but it's about the flow of the medium upon the surface of the paper. On the whole, an original drawing has a kind of rhythm to it because it is being created from the signals from the brain to the hand, and it starts, while a copy, if you're looking at and I would here say that it's always very useful, I think even as a very bad artist myself, that if you've actually done a bit of drawing or painting or whatever, you understand the process. That there is not that moment of invention. You are just copying what's before you, so it has a much more uniform feel. There is the changes in pressure, where an artist is pushing harder on the chalk or the pen or whatever it is, because he has a particular inflection that he wants to put down on the paper, an expressive moment he wants to stress. In Michelangelo's case, the hip or the shoulder or the movement. A copyist, on the whole, won't have that. But there are some extremely, when you are not at all sure, and the most difficult things is when you have 2 or 3 copies and you decide that the the most fluent one of them is probably the original, and then suddenly up comes, pops out of somebody's attic, a work that reveals that in fact all three are copies, and that the judgment in Paris that you've done between deciding which of them is the freest actually was a false one. So one always has to keep that in mind. But yeah, I mean, one tries one's best to describe that. Well, you can read my entries on the collections online and critique them.
Thank you. Alex?
Do you think there's a danger in using the term copy? When copy comes out of, even Richardson talking about connoisseurship, and he says one of the reasons why I started looking into connoisseurship was to determine which was true and which was a copy. And I can certainly see that, especially with Renaissance drawings, yes, there are lots of copies made afterwards, but copies are very interesting objects in themselves.
No,
and
absolutely.
B, once you start moving 18th and then certainly in the 19th century, artists making replicas after their own work, suddenly people still use, and I actually worked in the trade and then moved to museums myself. When I was in the trade, it's just a copy, it was less interesting, it was worth less. Moving to museums, you suddenly realise that they have a lot of value, and I wonder if the term copy is something negative that's come out of connoisseurship.
Yeah, I take your point. I mean, I share with you. I think a copy is a very is fascinating in itself, and I suppose one could look for another word like a version, but even I don't necessarily see it in a pejorative sense. But I agree. Obviously, for the market, the difference between an original and a copy can be huge. But if you can come up with a better term, please. A translation. Okay. Well,
Can I ask a question that's a broader one about whether you see, Hugo, and Spike too, whether you see connoisseurship as it's been described, for instance, by Bendor and by those practicing it on this everyday basis in the trade, as a craft. I mean that quite seriously. Does it have many of the characteristics of a certain kind of craftsmanship or a craft? And so, in a sense, it can be understood differently to other kinds of educational knowledge.
Yeah, I would say completely it is a craft. I see a lot of parallels with craft, and actually craft is one of the things that attracted me to conservation, because craft is seriously under threat in society generally, and I think it's in large part because it is unaccountable, and because you have to trust the craftsman, and the only way you can trust the craftsman is by their track record. So I see it very much as a craft, and whilst I presented something as a kind of party trick, it was as a suggestion that not everybody is going to be able to excel in that particular craft, but there are some easy first steps that can be made, and they are that is the teachable part. There is stuff you think about, but then once you've taken that on board, if you actually are a good connoisseur or good craftsman, then that becomes immediate. It is embodied knowledge is what I would think of it as.
It's just that it's interesting in relation to the discussion this morning about the training in connoisseurship and about the complaint that history of art departments are not training students in connoisseurship. Well, it does make me wonder about whether actually it falls upon the trade and on dealers and on auction houses to be doing that kind of training, because it's of a very different character in many ways to the kind of training that one would get in a university, which should be recognised as such rather than complained about.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, you see that. So I think connoisseurship's problem in the academy is no different from the problem of vocational training and why, if you like, the accountable surgeon has a higher status than the less accountable nurse, and because there's more craft in nursing. That it's not being recognised socially. So I think the problems with connoisseurship they are a symptom of a much broader political thing, and the academy is part of that.
Bendor. Yeah, and some others.
Thanks. Just on that point, I mean, that is an interesting, who should be doing the teaching. But if you accept my premise that, before, as I'm told, it used to, teaching used to be at the core told that before you can say a specific point about a Poussin, first prove to me that this is by Poussin. Then, if you accept my thesis that connoisseurship, the ability to spot who painted what, needs to be a fundamental foundation of art history teaching, then surely an element of that should be explored or taught in universities first, rather than left up to, coming after the interpretation, and when people will somehow have to find their way in the art trade afterwards.
I suppose the only thing about that, of course, is the person who was posing that question was Anthony Blunt, who was famously bad at spotting between a real and so it comes back again to authority. I mean, who's going to decide whether the Poussin that Blunt says is by Poussin or not?
Well, there are bad doctors and good doctors, but we don't question the whole of medical science on the basis of that.
No, indeed. I mean, I think I would agree with Martin, and I think that the ability to investigate a work of art and to ask the questions is only a part of being a good curator. And there are, some of my colleagues in the British Museum are not remotely interested in that aspect, and some of them, are. And they are, I think the idea of a kind of cookie cutter culture that you all have to be sort of good at spotting the difference would be wrong. I suppose in the end it comes down to whether you have an interest in it. I mean, I wasn't taught it really, it was just I was given the opportunity, exposed to it, and then I sort of, I was an autodidact of a particularly kind of ferocious kind. But I think if you don't take students in to look at works of art, that's probably not going to happen of their own volition. I mean, maybe. But, it's the fact that, our latest curatorial recruit is an Egyptologist by training. Whether that's a failure of art history, I don't know.
Other questions? I saw, is it? Yeah, no. I think Paul Spencer Longhurst, the guy with the red tie.
Very question.
Paul Spencer Longhurst.
Yeah,
yes. Just this one addressed to Hugo, returning from the speculative slightly to the slightly more factual, perhaps. Could you tell us something about the role of collectors' marks and watermarks in your experience?
Well, I mean, a watermark is a very useful thing in that it gives a rough idea of dating, but of course, when you look up a watermark in a book and it says 1560 or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that watermark was only in the year 1560. It just means that it's been found on a document that you can date to 1560, and for all we know, that watermark or a version of it could have been around for a long, long time. But obviously, if you're now and again, one has an absolute killer watermark where you say, this is by a particular 18th century Dutch artist, and it's on a watermark of a paper mill that didn't actually open until 1890, and then that's great. I mean, collectors' marks, can be useful, but they are quite easily faked too. Eric Hebborn was very good at the Reynolds mark, and Richardson too. So I'm not sure that's everything. I think you have to just take that entirety of the work before you. Its state of conservation, its provenance, its collector's marks, the paper. All of it is part of what makes you form your decision. And I think the great thing is, that you should be quite ready to say, I don't know. I said, almost increasingly I say, I don't know. I think, the pressure, and that's where the kind of ego comes into attribution, is, I know all about Italian drawings, I have to name things. And I think that is the mistake, because you're under pressure, and you just to say, sorry, I have no idea. And I think that's perfectly valid, but of course it's not terribly useful for the art trade. But hey-ho.
Yes, question over there.
Yes, hi, thanks. Rebecca Lyons, Christie's Education. I just had a point, really, I think, about the academic responsibility that we have, which is linking back to jargon, because we do teach a kind of connoisseurship, and we teach other things too. And I think it's partly the language that is so important in helping students to put into words the things that make us able to make decisions, and teaching that as a kind of conscious competence, not the unconscious competence of a light bulb moment where you go 20 years, I just know it, I feel it, or, as you illustrated there, I thought very well, the sort of comeliness of line, oh darling, look at the colour, which I think gives then also an exclusivity to learning about art, which makes us part of a rarefied club of people who are in the know. And I think that if we can consciously take that responsibility of putting it into words properly and clearly, in a way that's part of our mission to all the avenues that it opens up, that we don't become part of a group who put people off by the fact that either the words that we use or the things that we know about are exclusive. And so I would argue that connoisseurship is and should be at the heart of what all of us are teaching the new generations. But I think that's pretty much what you're both saying. Or
I was trying to suggest that the mystique can be deconstructed, and I was very pleased that people have demonstrated that.
Yeah.
And the one thing he didn't refer to in Richardson, which impacts on the comments Spike was making subsequently, is the importance, I forget the exact phraseology, but it occurs in the Guidebook to Rome, I think in the Discourses of 1719, that painting and drawing are very difficult things to do, but learning to look is more difficult still. And you can spend a lifetime doing it, and there's no guarantee that at the end you'll be as much better as you hope than you were at the beginning. This impacts again on the concept of connoisseurship as a craft, and the decline of the apprenticeship system has impacted, I think, on the way people have been taught to learn to look, because there's no better way, in my experience, of learning how to look than having a conversation with somebody who's been doing it for a very long time. And I was lucky enough to know informally David Carrott when I was still at Cambridge, and I used to come out to London, and he was very kind to me and took time to just spend 20 minutes looking at a picture and dissecting it. And I learned more in 20 minutes than I learned in to have that type of exposure of somebody who had actively looked and was very good at articulating the manner in which they looked, I will never forget.
That reinforces my feeling, and I'm very surprised at how few art history students in Cambridge come to the Hamilton Car, which is only like 8 miles away, because the conservators there will sit in front of the same painting for months on end, and quite a few of them are articulate. And I don't feel I am, but they are able to talk about what they're looking at. And I'm amazed at how that opportunity is not taken up by students.
But then again, there is a huge opportunity provided by, going on YouTube and looking at, there are very good arts programs, there are very good things available where people speak about particular, techniques, and, certainly I've learned about printmaking techniques from looking at YouTube videos of people doing it. Maybe it's...
I agree, there's a certain amount, but you cannot beat the object. And one of the things that you learn as a conservator is you do not rely on words. You stand around and you say, it looks like that. So you point at things, you don't try and describe them. And then you point at them in a context in which they can interpret the meaning of that. And everybody says, well, it's that, it's not that. And we don't use specialised words because I don't think it's particularly helpful, but actually engaging with the object is crucial.
Yes, there's a question. The guy with the black jacket.
Hello, I'm Andrew. quick and independent researcher on 17th century paintings, but I just wanted to follow up on the point, sort of how far you can get teaching yourself using maybe alternative means if you don't have a mentor, or if you haven't been lucky enough to study for an extended period of time. And I think that we shouldn't underestimate the value of digital resources. And I know you can't, it's never as good as the real thing. But from personal experience, I can say like you can learn a lot in a very short amount of time. And I think we've probably never been closer in history to like getting next to the object from thousands of miles away than we are now. So perhaps that's part of an answer to addressing the sort of decline of the mentorship system.
You're absolutely right. I mean, when I say the object is crucial, I stand by that, but there's a lot of steps on the way that you can make in a remote manner. But that requires a lot of investment in websites, and the quality, I don't think it is there. You have to have the X-ray, the infrared, you have to be able to overlay them, you know, see the front and the back, the raking light and all of those things. Whilst some things have been done at that level, not a lot has.
Yeah, I think people will be pleasantly surprised, though, if they look how much there is out there. I know I was for particular artists, in conjunction with the Google Art Project, and even just what other amateur researchers have posted online. You can go a long way. So, yeah.
Hello, Kate Aspinall. I just had a quick question. I was wondering if you could speak to the role of memory in this whole trend. We've been talking a lot about how connoisseurship perhaps is being outdated. And one of the things, as a social history or intellectual history trained art historian, I feel like in people my age and younger, there's a trend away from memorization and towards an analysis of data. And I'm just sort of curious what your thoughts are on that.
It's a very good question. I think one of the problems I have with digital media is that they are a surrogate for memory, and that one has to train memory. And if one relies on Google, you're not training your memory. So I think there are real issues. There are real issues, and the way in which we have conflated data and information and knowledge is quite worrying as well. Data is not information. Information is not knowledge. Yet we are scored usually on data and information.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Sarah?
Well, this is not from me, but from someone who is watching us online, and there are between about 40 and 50 people also watching the conference. So, and this is from Helen Hughes, who is, I believe, a paint historian as well. And I think this is for you, Spike. She says, are conservators, because of their hands-on experience and hours with objects, today's connoisseurs? And particularly, she notes that conservators have an understanding about how objects change over time and can unpick those changes. And perhaps as well that speaks to how we use digital and how those hours and thinking about layering and changes over time is something that she would like to raise as well.
Well, I think this morning had issues about what connoisseurship was in terms of the wider cultural issues that Martin was dealing with. And of course, I don't think the conservator has anything necessarily to offer there at all. But in terms of the base level, identifying what it is we're looking at, then yes, the conservator does have a great deal to offer. And the way in which paintings change over time is quite complex. And conservators are particularly good at reading that. So I think that this morning there was a wish that we would all collaborate more. That was in the context of the museum and the market, but I would say also the academy and the craft as well. There's a lot of mileage to be made if we work together.
And if I could add that one of the high points of my time as a curator was working on the Italian Renaissance drawings. We did a a project of looking at the materials. So we were looking at, so there were scientists doing infrared, Raman spectrography. There were paper conservators who were very used to kind of looking at these from a paper angle, and me, and that collaboration between looking at these things from different angles. And sometimes the scientists would get incredibly excited because there was sort of a chemical with an amazing amount of 2's and N's in it. So I would sort of say, well, that's great, but what does that sort of tell me about the making of this thing? And in fact, it turned out to be 1970s kind of retouching. But framing the questions and that kind of working together to look at something certainly was hugely instructive. I learned a massive amount from it, and I think collaborations of that kind are very, very important in refining your knowledge.
I would totally agree, but I would say they're also quite difficult to do.
Well, you need a lot of time, yes.
Most of our education has been quite narrow, and overcoming that, which is what I think connoisseurship requires, takes quite a bit of effort on the side of everybody involved, I think.
Yeah, I think you need the humility to say, look, I don't know anything about this, tell me about it, and that's...
Thanks. I was quite pleased to see that both of your talks were talking about taxonomies, especially at the nationalistic level. And it
about what?
At the national categorizations.
Taxonomy, yeah. Sorry.
Taxonomies. Yeah. And because connoisseurship, evolved throughout the 17th, 18th century, and found its golden age in the 19th century, that is exactly the time when, national states are created, and England plays a vital role in defining this, and the fact it's an island has in a way helped as well. But at the same time, most of the connoisseurs train their eyes on Italian, Flemish, Dutch paintings, which is exactly the European countries that don't have that, well, they didn't have the kind of uniformity. And in fact, as you were showing, Antonello da Messina as a classic case, as well as many others. And it seems to me that, for instance, we don't reflect enough on the way we use these national labels to define and pigeonhole certain drawings at a time when the nations didn't exist. At the same time, how, in a certain way, that exposes how connoisseurship relies on this mystique of uniformity, of homogeneity, which is hardly ever the case. And it seems to me that most connoisseurs always tend to be to think of the disciplines or the falsification of connoisseurship in terms of zooming. So they think we're going from the vague Italian school, and then over the years we're not trying to find the more specific, identity. But this obviously is a myth, because we got artists that don't follow, this kind of canonical patterns at all.
Yeah, I would completely agree that it's a taxonomy building exercise, but what I was trying to do was this morning was the idea of thinking and blinking, or quick and slow learning came up. And I don't think there's any competition between them. One has to do slow thinking before one can do quick thinking. One has to put the legwork in before you can see it as a light bulb. And so I was trying to do that in 5 minutes, which is a tall order, and therefore I did choose things not necessarily, although we use the label as the nation state. My thinking, which I tried to explain, was a coherent craft practice, and that coherent craft practice is sometimes very localized. So an individual city in the Flemish, for a decade, you can say, well, they're doing that then. But in Italy, it's all over the place. And my interest is not in terms necessarily of trying to put things into categories, but to say, when you have something like British art, which is very eclectic, where are those influences coming from? And I reiterate something Hugh said, which is that you look for every single thing you can look for, which is the watermark on the paper and everything. And if you can find something technical, or the conservators can provide something technical in addition that you want to look for, well, that's all well and good.
I find the difficulty you're describing right now, I find it to be at the core of these issues of connoisseurship, because how can we deal with, for instance, an artist, as you were mentioning before, like Bellini, who changes technique within the same painting?
Well, exactly, but that's a very interesting thing, because you could also through his career.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not trying to say this is a definitive Bellini. All I was trying to do was suggest you can see, and that's why the two examples I gave were both outliers, which were wrong, to try and make your point that we're not looking at static categories. We're looking at influences, and it's bound to be messier than I pretended.
And fields at the same time, they're not uniform, but they break apart all the time.
Yeah.
Great. Any other specific questions to Hugo and to Spike? And then maybe we can open it up after that. Katie.
Thank you. I think this slightly follows on from the previous question and also goes back to this morning. I was really struck by something that Stephen Dukas said about, and I may not be phrasing it quite right, but that some art historians hide connoisseurship behind material culture. I hope I've phrased that right. And I was quite struck by the fact that both of you showed us quite different images in some cases to the kind of images we've seen this morning, because there has been quite a focus on painting. And I thought Spike made the really important and interesting point that looking at a scientific image requires connoisseurship as well, but it's not a type of looking that we would apply the term connoisseurship to. So I wondered also in terms of what Martin was saying this morning. I think he used the phrase putting stuff in an exhibition alongside the Dobson painting. So I wondered if there is a sort of crisis in connoisseurship, one of the things that we need to take into account is that art history is very much broadening the types of images and objects that we look at, and therefore we don't consider connoisseurship to be valid, relevant, whatever the right term is, to these different types of imagery or objects.
Well, I would agree with you. I think art history has become a much sort of broader church. I mean, I think the idea 20 years ago you'd be, the head of the Prince of Drawings would be showing you images of the trade cards of Sarah Sophia Banks would probably be, well, actually with Anthony, that's probably untrue, 30 years ago, would probably be laughable. And obviously the skill set of the connoisseur, in inverted commas, as I say, they're not very useful for a large class of material. You need other skills to be brought to bear. I mean, I suppose what I look for, if in terms of somebody who I'd like to work alongside, is sort of visual curiosity. Really, I mean that's really the kind of the core of what makes a good curator. Is they're interested in what they see and they want to ask questions of it, and interesting questions at that, and don't want to sort of close it down in a particular way. And some of that is useful to know what it is, but large areas aren't. What do you?
Yeah, I would completely agree, and I would think that science has got more of an opportunity to play a game in this context now, because much more of science or much more of the output of science is in visual terms. So mentioned, and even a graph is actually just a rather boring painting. And as long as the data is presented in a visible manner, which is increasingly the case, especially with complex data. I showed you scatter plots of crack patterns. Actually, the statistics behind that are incomprehensible, but the output is a visual thing that can be interpreted.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Now we're due to have tea at 4:45, and the idea was that we'd have a tea break, and then Liz will be giving her keynote, and then we'd have a short discussion maybe after that, and then head towards drinks because it's getting towards the end of a Friday. So in many ways, the next half hour does give us a chance to step back a second before we listen to Liz's paper, which I think in itself will touch upon lots of the issues we've been discussing today. And it would be great over the next few minutes if we could just, as I said, take a step back from the particulars of Hugo and Spike's talks and about the kind of issues that you think maybe haven't been addressed adequately or at all in the discussion so far that you might want to raise, particular kind of thoughts that you might have got which come out of listening to a whole range of papers on this topic. It would be great if we had some more general reflections on this issue now that we've heard five papers on it. Beginning with Martin.
Jumping in. The term collaboration is come up in a number of contexts through today. And so my question is a rather general one, and it's probably for everybody on the panel there, including Mark himself, about how the landscape of research funding has changed over the last 8 years or whatever it is now, and particularly with the HRC collaborative doctoral funding scheme, which is now kind of dominating how art history, I don't know if conservation is a similar situation, but certainly how art history is being taught. My question is, do you think this is changing the landscape? Is it changing the way that scholars who are being trained now are working with objects, or take into account the kind of issues that we're talking about in relation to connoisseurship, or is it actually illusory? Because one of the claims of the collaborative doctoral scheme is that it provides a kind of vocational or craft dimension to academic training.
It's just, I don't know if everyone in the room knows about these, maybe as well as we do, Martin, but just to summarise, over the last number of years, a lot of PhDs have been funded, state-funded, which are called collaborative doctoral awards, in which the students, and there may well be people here in the audience who've gone through this process, are affiliated both with a university department, history of art department, and an individual supervisor in that department, and with a gallery or museum and a curator in that gallery or museum. And the idea is that the student will work across both of those arenas, both of those institutions, and learn skills that would relate to those particular institutions too. So, I mean, I guess the question it's an interesting question about whether that's been something that you've been seeing in operation at the British Museum, because, or elsewhere in the institutions represented here in the room.
Yes, and it's true both of curatorial departments and also in the scientific area too. Well, I think it has got the potential of bridging this supposed chasm between these two worlds. But a lot of the time, it's, as in all these things, is dependent on the individuals concerned. And I suppose one of the issues about it is where it pushes museum research. I mean, that you sometimes are moving away from looking at your collection in a particular way towards broader research questions, which may be the right way to go, but some maybe the kind of particularity of the collection is lost in those. I mean, we have a research project which is looking at the beginning of faiths in the first millennia. I mean, that's a very broad area, and the amount to which that is going to feed back into the knowledge of the collection is open to question. But I think it does. I mean, if it's well crafted and you've thought beforehand how those two sides are going to work, I think it has enormous potential, yes, and has been very successful with us. I mean, Martin, you're a kind of the king of the CDA, so maybe you should. Plethoras of. Well, how about Tate?
I think I hadn't thought of an answer as well as asking the question. But I mean, I think it is changing the dynamics of the job market actually, and collaborative doctoral awards do provide a degree of experience which gives you an edge in this day and age. So I think there is a sense of the people who are feeding into the curatorial world often have, not always, but they often have this background. So I think that is a real factor for the way things are working now. I mean, I suppose I have a slight question. Is this slightly illusory in that was there really a time when people weren't looking at objects or looking at collections or looking at artifacts? And I think most people were. But also, I think that there's a sense of the museums potentially driving research agendas. And I'm not sure myself, and I say this as somebody kind of in a museum context, I'm not sure that's always the best route actually. But that's moving us a little bit away from the question of connoisseurship and the sorts of skills. But I think there is scope, or there is a tendency now to start thinking about collections as the kind of framing device for art history. as opposed to the individual artifact or the kind of big narratives which perhaps the kind of university art history is focused on. Because people are doing PhDs in the context of collections, think about individual artifacts and objects, but also thinking about those collections as having histories and having a kind of providing a framework.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Any other broader thoughts about the issues that we've been focusing
on? Ilva French. I wanted to mention an initiative which most of you are familiar with, which is the Public Catalogue Foundation and the BBC Your Paintings website, and which reinforces something somebody said earlier about the proportion of paintings which are not attributed correctly or not attributed at all, if you have a look at that website. But the point I wanted to make was about country houses in private ownership and their collections, which are not featured on that website for good reasons in some cases, like security, problems with security and so on. But it means that a large resource of art is not generally available and is not always very well looked after or curated properly in country houses around the country, including Scotland. And I think Bendergome illustrated that in his recent programme about the portrait of Bonnie Prince Charles. And I've had some experiences of going behind the scenes, so to speak, behind the public galleries of country houses and seen some amazing paintings. And I just wondered what your thoughts are about that. I'm sure Stephen Duke has had some amazing experiences as well, but I would just be interested to know what you think about it.
Any thoughts on this issue of particularly of works of art held in private hands in private collections that are not receiving the attention that they are due? Any thoughts, Johnny? Because there are initiatives going on at the moment. Johnny will talk about this, which are about doing exactly this.
Just to say, the Mellon Centre has very kindly funded the Revivify National Photographic Survey, which is doing precisely this, which is photographing private collections, historic collections, so that objects have a context and that the photographic record should be available in photographic libraries. Exactly how this will evolve over the next coming years, I'm not sure, depending on funding. But we are doing it, and we've taken, I think, 600 photographs in the last 2 months of 3 private collections. So it's ongoing.
Thanks. Just slightly on that point and what we were saying earlier about digital images online. One of the reasons I think today's conference is timely is that we're in the middle of, or on the threshold of, a very exciting time when we've had access to more imagery, high resolution colour photographs than ever before. And so that's why it seems to me we need to look afresh at connoisseurship and how we do it and how we teach it, because there is so much more to learn now than we've been able to before from that point of view. And I know Andy. Oh, he's got his hand up. There we are. No, that was Mark Anthony. Is Andy Ellis still here?
I'm not sure if Andy's here at the moment.
He was here earlier, but I know we're launching this website called Art Detective on Monday, which will allow everyone, experts, members of the public, to write in and suggest attributions. We can have debates going online about pictures which have attributions or the wrong attributions in the PCF's online collections. So it's a very exciting time.
Yes.
I was just going to say, there's a sort of a conception that there's some kind of opposition between the aura, the original work of art, and first photographic and now digital images, whereas quite a bit of evidence suggests that the opposite is the case, and that the great age of connoisseurship coincided with the use of photographs to allow comparison, and we now have, yes, another fantastic kind of resource that allows us to do things at distance, which is difficult with and that one would hope that could actually serve as a increasing the craving to see the things even better and go and look at them.
Mm-hmm. I certainly don't think it's replaced. I mean, we were very worried when our collection was going online that the numbers coming into our study room would fall away dramatically. But in fact, if anything, they increased because people began to actually become aware of what you had. And so all sorts of things, that were fascinating to them, may they be Honus Wagner, cigarette card or whatever, they realised, they were there. So I think that is part of a trend.
The question I've got, which is, I guess, directed at those who would proudly define themselves as connoisseurs, is about the ways in which the skills that you've got and the particular ways in which you engage with the art object can transform or improve, make a big contribution to the writing of art history. Because in certain ways, you've talked about the blink moment and then the moment of attribution and identification and of dating. And then you've talked, Hugo, about the kinds of ways in which you feel obliged to write about the basis for those identifications and attributions. But then in terms of somewhat of scholarship, and a scholarship that's not about taxonomy or attribution, but about interpreting, explaining works of art, what are the particular things that connoisseurship can bring to that process that would encourage the possibility of a very different kind of art history writing? And that's a big question, I think, for me, and I think for many of us as writers and researchers in this field.
Sorry, I'm getting a lot of mic time again. I think the answer to that is